Well, as all good teaching should do, we're going to start with a little exercise, a little activity. Okay, so listen up, your thinking heads on. Sort the list of words into alphabetical order. I'll give you 15 seconds for this one. Now, the interesting thing about that as an exercise is what you call an algorithmic exercise. In other words, you have to do it. You can only solve that problem through a series of step-by-step procedures. So first of all, you have to identify the first letter, and then you realize that that isn't going to solve the problem. So you then make the second step, go on to the second letter. Then you realize that solves some of it, but you have to go on to the third one. So you go through a series of algorithmic steps where you're making these procedural choices to arrive at the right answer. And that process, that was a question from an IQ test, actually. That process measures our mind's ability to perform what cognitive psychologists call algorithmic cognition. And it's essentially based upon three components. One is working memory. That's the ability to hold simultaneously thoughts in your head, which you're actively using. The other is your processing speed, how quickly you can then compute those ideas and form conclusions from them accurately. And thirdly, learned knowledge. Because, of course, you couldn't have solved that problem without knowing the English alphabet. So at some point, you've had to learn that. And IQ is basically composed of those three elements. And it's a bit like an engine. So if you think about your mind as a car that is proceeding along the data road of the world, and it is computing data as it goes, your ability to perform those algorithmic calculations fast and accurately, and then accumulate that knowledge, is your algorithmic engine. And of course, it's most relevant when we are driving along a straight data road. What do I mean by that? Well, one example of a straight data road would be an exam or a test with predictable task, question and response formats. In other words, you haven't got to make any choices. You haven't got to work out what sort of approach you're going to use. You are simply performing the task, and the task is consistent and repeated, and you can just perform it accurately as fast as you can. Another would be learning in a class environment where there is in-class teaching which is directive and uniform and instructional. So the choices that you can make, the divergences you can make, the opportunities to steer off the road are very limited. So those are straight road data contexts. And it's no surprise that children who have large engines, have high IQs, succeed in those learning environments. And broadly speaking, school is that sort of learning environment. And that's why there is a high correlation between IQ and academic outcome. So whilst we as teachers might like to think we create a varied, epistemologically heterogeneous environment, we're actually creating very constrained, narrow, homogeneous environments where the task responses are very predictable. But life is not a straight road. We have to navigate bends and signposts and traffic. We have to negotiate. We have to change. We have to fail. We have to make choices. We have to work out how we're going to navigate this road. Okay, so algorithmic thinking that you've just done. Here's another exercise for you, just to keep you awake. Just read that through. In fact, I'll read it out to you, and let's just do this together. Okay, so imagine yourself in a place that you know, or a place that you can imagine. You can choose anywhere you like. Take a look around. What can you see? What can you hear? Walk around. Choose a part of this place that you would like to keep for yourself. What could you put around it to show that it's yours? Perhaps a line or a wall or a fence or a ditch or a hedge or anything else that you can think of. From now on, we're going to call this your space. Walk into your space. Now, I want you to answer this question. Someone says you should change your space. Would you change it? Now, how is your mind answering that question at this moment in time? Well, it relies on your mental simulation networks. The first thing you had to do was to imagine a space in your mind and then see yourself in it. Now, that required you to consciously integrate a whole variety of memories about yourself as a person so that you could represent yourself to yourself in this imagined space. And in fact, funnily enough, the space that you imagined reflects a lot of the characteristics you see of yourself, which if we had time we could explore. So your memories of yourself, what you look like, what you're good at, what you hope to achieve this year, what you're afraid of, something you're ashamed you've done. All of those memories of yourself are stored in various networks around your brain, but they are reintegrated in a region of your brain in that exercise called the hippocampus, which is where we pull a version of ourselves, we self-represent. And one of the reasons that we've learned that we do this cognitively is to then be able to simulate how we might stand in different situations that we face. So if you think back, you mentally created that space and then you were asked that question. Someone says you should change your space. Would you change it? Well, how did you answer that? You know, I don't mean what answer did you give, but how did your brain do that? Well, it did it because you imagined what it would be like for someone to say that. You imagined how you'd react. And then you imagined, well, who is this person? And you imagined, well, it would be different if it was my mum to my, wife or best friend. And so you performed a whole series of imaginative operations in order to answer that simple little question. Mental simulation network centered on the hippocampus, integrating our conscious and unconscious memories. Okay, so what's the significance of this? Why am I telling you these things? Okay, well, I want to show you one of the functions that this process has for you. So just read that. Okay, you all done that? Mm-hmm. Now answer that question. Now, how have you done that? Well, extraordinarily, you've been able to imagine in some form or other those from your school in your space with you. And in some way, you've actually been able to answer that question, such that whilst you might have given one answer last time, some of you have changed your answer in response to the cue that we inserted into that imagined space of school. You made an adjustment. And it all relied upon that mental simulation, that imagining of yourself, that integration of your sense of who you are, and then simulating how you might behave, what the consequences of that might be, and then choosing to respond. And that process was very flexible, such that if we inserted another cue, let's call it a priming cue, of school into that space, it shifted how you then managed that space that you were in. Now, you might think that that process is not particularly significant. You might think that that's a mental process that's quite trivial. But if I was to tell you that that process that you've just done there underpins all of the data that I showed you this morning about mental health, about academic outcomes, about the difference between boarding and day schools, about girls and boys, if I told you that all of that data was obtained by asking children to respond to a series of questions that they listened to and then they answered, you might be a bit surprised. Because what it tells you is that that process is not trivial and it's not insignificant. The fact that it's easy to do is deceptive. It's hugely influential in how we navigate the world. And in fact, we use it to navigate 7 biases. 7 steering biases. Now you'll recognise 4 of those on there, but there are 3 more as well. Now these steering biases have helped us to identify some previously unquantified characteristics of school, the effect that school is having. So your schools are actually like a road affecting the way that your children are steering those biases as they go through your school day. And that is correlating with the academic success of your school. It's correlating with the mental health outcomes of your school. It's correlating with the characteristics that are forming in your children. Okay, let's back up. So, we've done 2 mental exercises. The first one was that algorithmic exercise where we performed a set of procedures to arrive at an answer. And the second one was this mental simulation that we went through and which then guided how we responded to this situation that we were in. One algorithmic and the other we could call associative. It relies on associative processing where you've associated together data about yourself, about the situation that you couldn't quite put your finger on, but which your brain has been able to integrate into this visualized form. And your children are doing this every day from the moment they arrive on the school campus to the moment they leave. So this is what is going to enable them to steer all the different activities you're going to be giving them. So you've asked a child to stand up in front of everyone else on the stage and give a presentation as the first activity in assembly. But then quickly they've got to stop doing that and join in with everyone else in a collaborative team exercise that requires a totally different set of behaviours and responses. You've asked them to choose whether to join in with the risks that others are taking at break time, but then also to cope with being left out emotionally when they choose not to join in. You've asked them to work on their own and be focused and resourceful, but you've also asked them to notice when they need to reach out for help and have the ability to have the capacity to do so. You've asked them to not get thrown by setbacks and failures, but also to be able to set themselves targets and celebrate their success. You've asked them to do all of those things. And the only way they're able to do that is by that mental function of what we call steering, of imagining how they're going to behave and then choosing their response to it. And it's a different cognitive process to their algorithmic thinking. Now, let me qualify how it's different and how it's connected. It's not different in the sense that it's parallel, in the sense that we can either process algorithmically or we can process associatively. It's connected like a car with an engine and with steering. In other words, before we come to know anything, we first steer towards it or away from it. And I'll just illustrate this to you. This is based upon the fact that most of the time the brain is ignoring most of the data around it. We tend to think that the brain's unique capacity is to process a huge amount of data. Actually, its greatest ability is to ignore most of the information available to it. Just notice what your hands are doing right now. Just notice how they're feeling, how they're sitting, what you're doing with them. Okay, all conscious of that? Now, the interesting thing was that 20 seconds ago, none of you were aware of your hands. You had no consciousness of this data, this touch, this tactile sensory information. You were ignoring it. because it wasn't relevant to you. So the question is, how does the brain choose what to ignore and what to pay attention to? And then how does it make adjustments when the situation changes and we need to pay attention to something else? How does it steer a varied road? Because remember, the road, the real road, is not like a classroom. It's not straight. The real world involves us making adjustments all the time as we move from person to person, situation to situation, task to task. And it's not our engine that enables us to steer. It's not our IQ. It's a different cognitive process. Now, we did a study where we showed that those 3 core curriculum subjects actually required children to adjust those steering biases differentially as they went from maths to science to English. In other words, you couldn't, remember those 7 biases? You couldn't just adopt the same steering pattern, being high trust of self, but big picture focused and being low disclosing, just as an example. You couldn't adopt that as the successful steering pattern for learning at school and then do that everywhere. You had to make adjustments to those, all 7 of them, as you went from one subject to another. Now, of course, you're clever enough to know exactly why that is, because maths, epistemologically, is a different kind of learning, a different sort of knowledge to the humanities, to English, to the arts. Scientific discovery is epistemologically different from mathematical knowledge. We can't acquire data on the world through the same steering strategies. We have to bias our attention differently. And in fact, there are a set of distinct and optimal biases associated with children who learn best in those subjects. But the key thing is that they can actually adjust them. By the way, before you take a picture of that, they're not those biases. You can read the paper, which I'll point you to if you want to know which ones are. So, children who learn to steer, who can make those adjustments along the varied road of school and life, are more emotionally resilient, more socially agile, and more effective learners in the classroom. Now, that's empirical. That's not just me saying, I think this is the case. It is the case. Now, what's interesting about this, let's call it steering cognition, because that's what it seems to describe, the way we steer the road, is that it is independent of IQ. In other words, it's unrelated to whether someone has a high IQ or a low IQ. How big their engine is, it makes no difference to whether they can steer or not. And it governs a set of things that are related to these characteristics: social emotional management, metacognition, the ability to learn about how we're learning and choose varied strategies, real-world learning, real-world judgment. And what's interesting is that all of those kinds of characteristics there fall into a sort of bucket of non-academic characteristics that for a long time schools have been aware of but haven't known how to measure. They've said, well, we know that education's more than just academic outcomes. We know it's more than IQ. We think it's to do with character, with soft skills, with people skills, with social emotional intelligence. But it's a bucket of stuff. But what underpins it all consistently is this unified learning with these 2 components: steering and engine. So in a sense, we're talking about changing unmeasurable qualities of education and skills and making them measurable, because remember, we've measured these things. That's the data I was showing you before. Now, okay, you'll be glad to know I'm nearly finished. But I just want to land this, because we're here for a conference on technology and AI in education. And one of our questions was, what kind of cognition is machine resistant? In other words, in the coming decades, what will machines replace and be able to do as well or better about human thinking? And that's a really important industrial question for us to answer. What will we be left to do? And actually, it's also an existential question. What is uniquely human? Now, you're about to have one of the world's experts tell you about AI. So I'm not even going to pretend to do any more than to say that, broadly speaking, this is how AI works. Massive data networks connected together, layered processing, weighted probabilities, and at its center, a decision-making algorithm of such complexity, and indeed that may be changing, such that the coder doesn't even know what it is themselves, and producing a set of AI outcomes. That's how AI works, and Professor Stephen Roberts in a moment is going to give us the most brilliant explanation of the real machinery of AI. But just for the moment, let's accept that. And it's a kind of engine, and the key word in there is algorithmic. AI thinks algorithmically. It thinks algorithmically. It's like a huge juggernaut with unprecedented power. But this isn't algorithmic thinking. The ability to answer this question, remember, relies on a different cognitive capacity. It required that capacity to imagine ourselves, to imagine the other, to simulate possible ways that we might behave, to step into someone else's shoes, to step into possible futures. And it's my proposal to this conference that a machine cannot answer this question because it cannot think through those processes. It doesn't have a sense of I, it doesn't have a sense of the you, and it doesn't have a sense of the other. And it can't, that's self-consciousness. So those questions that we ask, 4 questions to isolate 7 biases to give us 28 responses, are telling us something uniquely human, which won't be replicated by machines. So there's the machine mind and there's the human mind, which has an engine. And in many ways, machines have been outperforming our engines for some time in startling and astonishing ways. And therefore, roles in the future which have a high proportion of just this are likely to become increasingly rare or even redundant. But roles which require both engine and steering are likely to remain uniquely human. And indeed, to land one more connection, if it is that machines cannot steer, and I'll leave Professor Roberts to confirm whether this is the case or not, if it is the case that they cannot steer, but are hugely powerful engines, then it behoves us to steer them.